Hello, thank you for tuning into this video where we're going to discuss part three of the New Right. Um, in this lecture, we're going to discuss what's happening culturally and socially in the 1980s. And as we see this major shift in American politics that we started talking about in the first two parts of these videos. Um, in part two, we went over Ronald Reagan's election and his early presidency and where he promoted trickle down economics, budget cuts for welfare programs, and tax cuts on big businesses and the rich in order to promote the economy as he saw it, that this money would trickle down to the rest of the nation. um, but at the end of that video, I mentioned that one of Reagan's lasting impacts on the United States was his appointment of 300 judges. And we'll get into that in just a second. So for today in this video, there's going to be two potential essay questions for the final that you could write about, which is how the first option is how was pop culture used for social commentary in the 1980s? Uh, Provide examples of that and what did they comment on? The second essay option that you could use for the final is how did Reagan's international policies impact the Cold War? Did Reagan solely put it into the Cold War, or were there other factors that contributed to the Soviet Union's collapse? And also keep in mind these ID terms that are listed on this slide too are all potential ID questions that you could write about on your final exam. All right, so as I mentioned before, one of Reagan's lasting impacts on the United States was his appointment of 300 new right judges in federal appeals courts. Keep in mind that only seven of these judges were African American, 15 were Latino, and two were Asian American. And the majority of the 300 were just white followers of the new right. Uh, and a lot of people took notice of this, especially the Democratic Party who criticized Reagan for this. Then in 1987, Reagan nominated Robert Bork to fill a vacancy in the Supreme Court. Um, Bork was a federal judge and a former Yale University law professor, uh, and he was a staunch conservative. He had opposed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, affirmative action, and Roe v. Wade decision in 1973. Um, and after a series of debates and stuff, as Reagan proposed for Bork to go to the Supreme Court, it was eventually shut down by the Senate by a vote of 58 to 42. But if Bork was nominated, it would have meant that a new right judge who did not support the Civil Rights Act and was staunchly against the Roe v. Wade um, would have, this could have potentially changed these hearings, made things different in the United States. Remember that Supreme Court positions are usually for life, and judges cannot easily be removed. So it's a big deal when a president nominates a Supreme Court judge, and if they do go to the Supreme Court, it's a lifetime position. But Bork's nomination was shut down, and African Americans read Bork's nomination as another signal of the conservative movement's hostility to their social, economic, and political aspirations. In our last video, we discussed how Reagan, one of his main policies was to cut social welfare, which deeply impacted African American communities across the country. Many African Americans at this time felt that Reagan didn't have their best interest at heart. Uh, and this was a time between the 60s and the 80s where more and more African Americans were being elected into public office and gaining representation in the government. At a national level, civil rights leaders like Jesse Jackson, as we see on this slide, um, became the first African American man to run for president when he campaigned for the Democratic Party nomination in 1984 and in 1988. Propelled by chants of "Run, Jesse, Run," which was one of his slogans, Jackson achieved notable success in 1988, winning 9 state primaries and finishing 29th, with second with 29% of the vote, which was huge. And Jesse Jackson became the first African American to run for a presidential nomination and win a significant percentage of that vote. Though he did not win, it represented this increase in his increase in popularity, and represented a growing acceptance of African Americans in the public eye and in government office. So Jesse Jackson, a huge civil rights leader who gained even more political fame during the 80s. The excitement created by Jackson's campaign mirrored the acclaim received by few prominent African Americans in media and entertainment. Uh, Comedian Eddie Murphy rose to stardom in Saturday Night Live and achieved box office success in movies like 48 Hours and Beverly Hills Cop. You can see Eddie Murphy's picture up here for the Beverly Hills Cop sort of poster in that top part. Also in 1982, pop singer Michael Jackson released his song Thriller, which was a best selling album of all time. Also, Oprah Winfrey began her phenomenal success of her talk show in 1985. That's a picture of her in 1986. Also, the comedian Bill Cosby's sitcom about the African American doctor and lawyer raising their 4 children uh, um, received one of the highest television ratings for in decades. So the Cosby Show during the 80s really exploded in popularity and really represented how Americans watching the show viewed African Americans at this time. It showed informed the viewers about issues of race and class for African Americans in the 1980s. And it represented the growing number of African Americans gaining middle class jobs and raising their social status during this time. The Cosby Show was a big hit in the 80s, and it brought forth a lot of issues of middle class families and black families that they had at the time. Uh, in recent years, Bill Cosby, he is in prison now because of, the crimes that he's committed. But at the time during the 80s, The Cosby Show was a monumentous hit and was one of those sitcoms who, again, like we mentioned in the 70s and the 60s, sitcoms really made social statements about what life was like for some people in America and some of the issues that were taking place in America at that time. Moving past, the media and pop culture and stuff, in the 80s, we definitely see an increase in overall standard of living for African Americans as more and more black families entered the middle class. However, there were some limitations to this. During Reagan's last year in office, the African American poverty rate stood at 31.6%, as opposed to 10.1% for whites. Black unemployment remained double that of whites throughout the decade. So there's still these issues of income and employment. Um, and By 1990, the median income for black families was $21,000, and which was 42% below the median income for white households. Uh, the Reagan administration failed to address these such disparities in wealth, and in many cases, he actually intensified them as well. Certain federal policies disproportionately affected racial minorities. Spending cuts enacted by Reagan and the congressional Republicans shrank aid to families with dependent children. Medicaid, food stamps, school lunch programs, and job training programs which all could have provided crucial support for African American households. So we see all these social welfare programs being cut, which drastically, disproportionately affected African American families and households. So in the 1980s, overall, African Americans made huge social and cultural and economic gains. But these groups were still challenged by the growing new conservative right, and faced many problems going into the 1990s, and many of these problems that still exist today, especially this wealth gap in America. So there were some good and bad in this, but now we're going to quickly discuss what's happening in the economy at this time. So in the 80s, we see a growing decline of the auto industry, which we've talked about in our previous videos. And we see an imbalance in American imports and exports. You know, between um, in the 1980s, exports grew from 36 billion in 1980 to 170 billion in 1987. Uh, but foreign competition battered the already um, failing uh, motor sector. This manufacturing sector now had to deal with international competition from Europe uh, and eventually from Asia as well. So the American economy was hurting, especially in the area of industry. Think about that Rust Belt that we talked about before. But also within the Rust Belt is also the agricultural heartland of America, this Midwest grain belt as well. And they face many hardships due to international competition of these other countries growing their own food products, and there's less of a need for American crops to go overseas. And so many American farmers during the 80s suffered because of this international competition. Musicians like Willie Nelson and Neil Young helped to put together a concert of fundraisers like Farm Aid across the Midwest during the 80s to try to help farmers out, raise money for them. Farm Aid was really a big thing at this time. My dad, he remembers seeing some Farm Aid posters around Illinois in the 80s to try to help farmers out. You can see one of the posters here, right? Neil Young, and it's one of the Farm Aid sessions, and then featuring Willie Nelson and Pearl Jam. So all these musicians sort of got together and tried to help farmers out by raising money through concerts. Um, and they even threw a concert at the University of Illinois football field. They transformed the football field into a rock concert, which I thought was pretty cool because my family is from Illinois and from around that area, so I didn't know about that. Um, at the other end of the economic spectrum, though, many wealthy white Americans thrived under the policies of the new right and continue as Reagan's policies continued to cut taxes on the rich and big businesses. So there was a lot of ups and downs in the economy in the 80s. While millions of Americans face economic hardships, especially in the Midwest and the rest across the Rust Belt, the Northeast, um, the Sun Belt industry actually increased, right? And we also see the innovations of new technologies, which we'll talk about in just a second. Um, but exponentially during the 80s, we see this huge divide in the wealth gap, right? So the poor got even poorer, and the rich, unfortunately, they got even richer, right? So this gap between the poor and the rich just grew exponentially during the 1980s. Now we're going to switch gear and talk about pop culture in the 80s. During the 80s, there was a lot of popular culture media being produced at this time, like songs, movies, TV shows that were social commentary of what's going on in America at this time. Both conservatives and liberals use media as a way to make statements about what's going on in America. For example, the militarism and patriotism of Reagan's presidency pervaded in movies like Top Gun and the Rambo series, starring Sylvester Stallone as a Vietnam War veteran haunted by his country's failure to pursue victory in Southeast Asia. So, so we see these movies that are classic action movies, right? That sort of represent this growing militaristic and patriotic feeling that many Americans had during the 1980s. And this is sort of championed by Ronald Reagan, who was all about militarism and patriotism and showing the rest of the world that America, could kick some butt, all that good stuff. So if you haven't seen these movies like Red Dawn, Rambo, the Rambo series, Top Gun, I encourage you to do so because today, I mean, they're just modern classics. And actually, I just found out that there's going to be another a remake of the Top Gun later on in 2020. So I found that pretty interesting. I encourage you to check out these movies. While you're at home, you can always just binge watch some movies. I know I have. Anyway, these films have some underlying messages in them about patriotism, militarism, reverence of the military, um, all that all that good stuff. So we see that these sort of conservative statements being shined through in these movies. Now, in contrast, we have in 1987 Stanley Kubrick's film Full Metal Jacket, uh, and director Oliver Stone's Platoon and Born on the Fourth of July, which all offered criticisms looking back on the Vietnam War and war in general. These movies had a completely different feel than Rambo or Top Gun, which praised patriotism in the military. If you haven't seen these films, I definitely encourage you to do them. They're anti-war, produced in and came out in the 80s, sort of looking back on that previous decade of the Vietnam War, how bad it was, um, and you can sort of see it in these movie posters as well. So like Full Metal Jacket. If you haven't seen that movie, it's a really good movie. It says in Vietnam the wind doesn't blow, it sucks, right? So Vietnam sucks. In Platoon, you could see on the bottom of that movie poster, the first casualty of war is innocence, right? So these men going to war are losing their innocence, um, and overall that war is not good. So sort of an opposite response to those previous movies, like I mentioned, like Rambo and those other action films at the time. But also we see in television, we see it, other representations of social commentary of the time too. We have TV shows like Dynasty and Dallas, which celebrated wealth and glamour, reflecting on the pride of consumption that emanated from White House and corporate boardrooms, right? So those two shows just sort of took a critical role, look at consumerism in America, right? The wealthy white families, what their lives were like. And they were really big hits at the time. Actually, I believe both of those shows have modern remakes that are on TV right now, both Dallas and Dynasty, which I think they're pretty good. Also, there was a famous film that came out in the 80s, Wall Street, starring Michael Douglas, Charlie Sheen, and Daryl Hannah, which was a huge film. Wall Street sort of took a critical role look at what's happening in Wall Street, right? This financial center of America, right? And the sort of sleazy money deals going on between them and stuff. Um, and it showed many people the excess that many rich people had at the time. Um, but the most significant aspect of a lot of popular culture in the 80s, however, was a lack of politics altogether. The vast majority of pop culture in the 80s was, in fact, apolitical. They didn't really have any statements, social commentary in them whatsoever. You have Steven Spielberg's E.T. Coming out this time, the extraterrestrial, right? You also have Indiana Jones, which was a huge hit, the Indiana Jones series at this time. You also have the Star Wars movies, episode 5 and 6 coming out. Um, and in the 80s, you also have popular hits like Footloose, 16 Candles, The Breakfast Club, Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which are all movies produced in the 80s, but really lacked any social commentary to them, right? I don't think any of those movies really had any social comments about them. But nonetheless, they were still great movies, right? Classics. And if you haven't seen any of these movies or only some of them, I encourage you to watch those as well if you haven't already. Um, generally, so generally at this time, the cinematic experience of movies like an E.T. or an Indiana Jones or Star Wars, right? The whole special effects and all that stuff. It really was more of a focus in the 80s than social commentary was. So you still had some movies that provided some social commentary, um, but like many of the films of the 1970s, uh, for example, you have Red Dawn, which was in that previous slide, right? Of the communists invading the United States, and these good American high school football players had to rise up and beat back the communists, right? That's as classic Cold War and anti-propaganda as you could find. So that came out in 1984, and that's, sort of looking back, that's very much the exception, not the rule. Generally, most people at this time were looking for these apolitical movies, these movies that, they're just good movies. Um, and Also, you have TV shows like The Cosby Show, like we mentioned before, but also Cheers was a big hit at this time. So you have many of those different things happening, but also Saturday Night Live was getting into its 10th year and was continuing to make skits about race and America and that stuff with Eddie Murphy as one of the stars of the show during that time. But perhaps one of the most popular programs that came on the air in the 1980s was MTV. MTV, it still exists today, but in the 80s it was very different. MTV was the place where music videos were shown to people in their homes. Um, on August 1st, 1981, at 12:01 a.m., MTV aired their first music video ever, which was the Bugle song "Video Killed the Radio Star," which was actually, it came out in 1979, but this was the first video that actually came out on MTV, and it was a huge hit. So I'll play you just a few seconds of it.
I heard you on the wireless back in 52, lying awake intently tuning in on you. If I was young, it didn't stop you coming through. They took the credit for your second symphony, rewritten by machine on new technology. And now I understand the problems you could see. I met your children. What did you tell them?
Video killed the radio star. Video killed the radio star.
Pictures came.
All right, I'm gonna stop it there. So, "Video Killed the Radio Star," first music video ever shown on MTV. So it was a huge hit. Um, and after that, MTV became a very popular music station. And then telegenic artists like Madonna, Prince, Michael Jackson, all skillfully used MTV to boost their reputations and album sales. Conservatives condemned music videos as corrupting the young people with vulgar and anti authoritarian messages, but the medium only grew in stature. So, MTV, amongst younger people at the time, I guess my parents' generation who grew up during this time, uh, they all watched MTV. It was very popular during the 80s, very iconic. And Michael Jackson's 1988 music video, Man in the Mirror, had many images of racism, poverty, starvation around the world. And many conservatives at this time just viewed these music videos as corrupting the youth, showing problems that don't really exist, or they pretend not to exist. Also, many conservatives of the new right at this time viewed MTV as going away from Christian American values. But MTV's popularity continued to grow throughout the 1980s, and made many of these people like Prince, Michael Jackson, Madonna even more popular, while at the same time gaining a lot of scrutiny from more conservative groups. Uh, now in recent now the 80s in recent years have made a comeback in popular culture. We have TV shows like Stranger Things and The Goldbergs, which if you haven't seen those shows, I encourage you to do so. Um, they're very good, and they sort of take a nostalgic look of what 1980s pop culture looked like. These shows are tapping into that well of good feelings and nostalgia targeted to people who grew up in the 80s. Don't get me wrong, I love these shows. I watch them all the time, but there's a reason why 80s nostalgia is so popular in recent years. Also, we're seeing all those remakes of 1980s movies making a comeback, and they have for the past several years. Um, so if you haven't watched those shows, I encourage you to do so. They really give a sort of lighthearted look of what was happening at the 80s during the 80s. Um, Also, moving past pop culture and cinema and TV and all that good stuff, we also see many technological and social developments in the 80s as well. For example, the Apple computer, introduced in 1977, was the first successful mass produced mini computer meant for home use. Now, computers had existed going back for years, going back all the way to World War II, but they were large. They took up a whole room. They were expensive, uh, and they could only do a limited amount of things. They only had like the computing power of like your calculator or something like that. That's probably an understatement, but overstatement. Anyway, it wasn't until Apple and Microsoft came out with their own personal computers that it became widely used in homes. So in the 80s, we see this growth of people buying personal computers for their homes. This only was expanded in the 1990s. In the 80s, cultural battles were even more heated in the realm of gender and sexual politics. And this brings us into what women were up to in the 80s. Um, by 1984, women in the workplace outnumbered those who worked at home, which was huge, right? We have more women in the workplace than ever, more women working than just staying at home, which was this huge transition. Also, you have more women going to work and gaining economic freedom in the 1980s. Also, women started to gain more representation in politics as well, taking public office. For example, New York Representative Geraldine Fierro became the first woman to run on a major party presidential ticket when a Democratic candidate, Walter Mondale, named her his running mate. So we have a potential, vice president running for presidential office, and this was the first time a woman was on the ballot as well. Perhaps one of the biggest issues women and Americans in general were divided on was this topic of abortion, which we mentioned in some of our previous videos. Remember that in 1973, Roe versus Wade was passed, but remained a very divisive issue throughout the 1980s and into the 90s, with conservative groups and Christian groups forming organizations to try to overturn the abortion hearings, and other liberal women trying to protect it, preserve it, and try to increase women's rights at this time. Also, in the 1980s, we see a new deadly illness emerging, which was the acquired immune deficiency syndrome, or AIDS, right? So we see the introduction of AIDS in the 1980s, which simultaneously devastated, stigmatized, and energized the nation's homosexual community. When when AIDS appeared in the early 1980s, most of its victims were gay men. And for a time when the disease was known as GRID, gay related immune deficiency. So this disease was initially blamed on homosexuals, and the epidemic rekindled older pseudoscientific ideas about inherent disease of homosexual behavior, right? So people start to blame homosexual communities for the AIDS crisis, saying that they're the ones who caused it, and homosexuals in the 80s were drastically impacted by AIDS, and they were stigmatized by the public even more so because of it. Medical professionals at the time didn't know what this disease was, how to cure it, or initially how to prevent it. Um, and there was a lot of confusion around AIDS at this time too, and many gay communities were targeted because of it. The Reagan administration met this issue with large indifference, and many conservatives of the new right viewed AIDS as God's wrath on the gays. Um, Many members of the gay community tried to gain support for more research for the disease by creating PSAs, trying to humanize people who were affected by AIDS, show them that they are just normal people who are suffering because of a disease. As the disease continued to impact people around the world, there eventually became government funding for a cure. And by 1987, the government spending on AIDS related to around 500 million, which was only 25% of what experts advocated for. So AIDS continued to be underfunded by the 1980s, but at least they were gaining some funding. And in 1987, Reagan convened a presidential commission on AIDS. The commission's report called for anti-discrimination laws to protect people from AIDS, with AIDS, from any discrimination, and withholdings of federal spending. Uh, this shift encouraged activists, nonetheless, on issues to push for abortion rights and gay rights. Um, and this continued to go for into the 1990s, as well as gay communities pushed for things like more representation. They also pushed for more rights, less discrimination. Um, but activists in the 1990s perceived um, preserving the status quo instead of building on previous gains. And this amounted to a significant victory for the new right. Uh, all right, so we talked a lot about pop culture and what's happening socially. During the 80s, there was a lot happening, and I encourage you to write about this topic for your final, potentially, because I think it's a very interesting topic to look at. And if you haven't seen any of those movies before, again, I encourage you to do so. I think they're pretty cool, and shows you what kind of pop culture things were happening at this time. All right, so please tune into part 4, which is one of the last official videos that you're going to need to watch for this class. So I encourage you to watch that as we wrap up Reagan's presidency and the Cold War. All right, so please watch that video. All right, thanks.